Thank you so much. Dear distinguished guests and dear speakers, fellow Rotarians, I'm privileged and honored today to moderate this conversation, as we are more than ever understanding how one new infection disease that emerges in human every 4 months. 75% of these emerging diseases come from animals, and according to the UN environment, we need to pay more attention on these signals that Mother Earth is sending to us, because this shows the close relationship between human, animal, and environmental health. Today, we are here to speak about climate change in the center and connect it to women's rights, because climate change is at the fulcrum of trends and acting as an impact multiplier and accelerator of challenges in people's lives. It certainly acts as an accelerator of displacement, whether we speak of the 20+ million people that are hit by climate-related disasters every year, or of the many more whose security and livelihoods are being steadily undermined by droughts, coastal erosions, and other forms of slow but radical environmental degradation. We are placing this in the center on the Earth Day celebration today on 22nd of April, because we are speaking at an event that is hosted by the Rotary Action Group for Refugees, for Forced Displacement and Migration, the Rotary Fellowship for Global Development. We are partnering on this event and very proud to have the support with United Nations Association of Greater Boston and the Rotary Club of Washington, D.C. Global and my Rotary Club of Newton. We are speaking today on this topic because we would like to raise awareness on the connectivity of migration and forced displacement with climate change, but at the same time to point out the importance of women's rights and launch an introduction of a resource that was created during the preparation on the Commission on the Status of Women 65. More than a decade ago, at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change side event that was at the time the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and today is the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, that time in Copenhagen, more than a decade ago. He said that we are confronted with a number of global mega trends that interact with each other: population growth, human mobility, urbanization, food, water, and energy insecurity, all compounded by the global financial and economic crisis. And we need to think how we can help vulnerable groups to be able, I'm sorry? There was some echo. We need to help vulnerable groups be able to find their path to prosperity, to solution. People need solutions, people need actions, and we need an approach that must be people-centered, that is building upon the strengths of people and communities while striving to reduce their vulnerabilities. People threatened by the impact of climate change need a hand up, not a handout. And this is why women need hand up and not a handout. Women's rights are important and are in the center of the Sustainable Development Goals and are connecting the importance of health and well-being, because every healthy society is based on healthy mothers giving birth to healthy children, but living in healthy families and healthy societies. Mother Earth is calling us today for actions, and we are hosting this conversation with distinguished speakers, and we will be starting with Ms. Eva Richter, who is the NGO representative to the United Nations for the Poverty Elimination and Community Education Foundation. She has taught at university level in the US and in China. She served as an executive committee member and at the NGO Committee on Migration, and she had co-founded the NGO Committee on the Status of Women at the United Nations. We are pleased to have her video shown today. addressing the topic on migration and refugees in regards to the resource that was created, which will be launched during today's event. So please allow me to share the screen, and I will play the video that is with Eva.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for having me here. It is a privilege to speak at this meeting. In an explicit pivot from policy to implementation, Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, answers and solutions to the many problems that bedevil societies everywhere in the world. The general lack of social protection safety nets, widening inequalities of status, lack of or inadequate access to justice, education, health, housing, etc., contribute to conflict and exacerbate violence, xenophobia, and racism. People migrate in search of a better life and find integration into host societies difficult. The Teaching, Learning, and Advocacy Resource presented here is designed to facilitate creation of a college or university course for practitioners that will both provide an understanding of the overarching policies and purposes that motivate specific interventions to create progressive change, especially for the benefit of migrant and refugee women and girls, and to give them some of the essential information and tools to bring about such change.
I'm sorry, are you able to see the screen sharing of the video? Okay, because it's showing to me that it's been paused.
It might also be used for study groups, advanced high school groups, or a socially conscious group like Rotary International that wants to understand the current migrant refugee situation in a human rights context. Now, each locality in which a practice is carried out is unique and different from any other. Cultural, political, economic, and social entities and structures vary from one country to another, and the local structures may also vary widely. Each policy implementation, each good practice or strategy must be tailored to the needs of a particular locale and its governing structures, though general principles of delivery and implementation, like mapping, gathering evidence, and so on, may be commonly followed. The goal is to make the policies and the ideals on which they are based, fairness, justice, equity, equality, women's empowerment, and gender equality, all in the context of a human rights framework, to make them work for the good and the harmony of an entire community. The goals and the policies are common. It is the practice that is unique. It is necessary when embarking on finding solutions to the many and varied challenges presented by migration and the integration into a given society of any particular group. First, to define terms, to understand the difference between migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced, and stateless people on the move, and the various benefits to which they are or are not entitled under specific circumstances. Refugees have certain rights which migrants do not have. Practitioners need to know what they're dealing with, the scope and nature and origins of the crisis under examination, and where the areas of greatest concern are located. Disaggregated data, disaggregated for gender, for age, for race, for many, many other factors, are essential for the creation of targeted policies and practices to alleviate the problems that arise at each stage of the migration journey. Those stages include pre-departure, transit and crossing borders, arrival at destination, and return. Principles for advocacy concerning migrants need to be formulated in terms of the human rights that must frame all interventions and work also to empower women. Available protections, principles of equal access that afford a 360-degree perspective and leave no one behind. Both of these are stated principles of the United Nations. And the concept of gender justice that addresses issues of impunity, stereotyping, and cultural norms and practices, all must be considered and integrated into the creation of effective practices. Basic methods and tools of advocacy must be taught, such as identification of needs, mapping in a cultural, economic, social, and political context, the inclusion of migrant voices, that is very important, as information sources and advocates, identification of good practices and evaluation of replication appropriate to individual situations, and finally, the creation and adoption of evidence-based, community-specific, durable solutions. All the major policy instruments covering issues of migration are listed in the teaching and advocacy curriculum, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees, together with its 1967 optional protocol, the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Their Families, the New York Declaration for Migrants and Refugees, the 2018 Global Compact on Refugees, the GCR so-called, and the Global Compact on Migrants, or the GCM, which has as its goal safe, orderly, and regular migration. In addition, since this guide was developed in connection with CSW 65, the annual meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women, that's the CSW, at the United Nations this year, 2021, belatedly celebrating the Fourth World Women's Conference in Beijing in 1995, major UN policies and documents relevant to migrant women and girls are listed, together with brief descriptions of their subject and purpose. These include the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is the convention commonly known as CEDAW, and came into force in 1979, and its optional protocols and recommendations, the Beijing Platform for Action of 1995, and the Sustainable Development Goals of 2015, together with their specific migration targets. Relevant UN agencies and entities concerned with migration are listed next, together with some description of their specific mandates and interests, and some of the relevant major documents they have released that could serve as guides for the student or practitioner. Finally, some of the major relevant civil society organizations are listed with their major contributions. Such organizations include, but are not limited to, the Civil Society Action Committee, the NGO Committee on Migration, the Women in Migration Network, and the Women's Refugee Committee. The list is comprehensive, but by no means exhaustive or complete. It can be added to as issues develop and change, and as developments on the ground bring new perceptions of how best to handle the many complex issues that migration entails. There are many reasons that cause people to migrate, but most leave to seek what they think of as a better life, with more opportunities for advancement for themselves and for their children. They migrate for economic reasons, to seek better job opportunities, better schooling for their children, more stable lives for themselves. They migrate as a result of political instability, conflict, and outright war. They migrate because of domestic and/or institutionalized violence and crime, gang warfare, domestic conflict, etc. They migrate because they have been targeted as a hated minority group and being deprived of their citizenship. They migrate because of natural disasters, their homes and lands devastated by outsized hurricanes, exacerbated by climate change, because a volcano has rained death and destruction on them and on their land, or an earthquake has reduced their homes and towns to rubble. They migrate when their water sources have dried up, turning their land into desert, the result again of climate change and/or poor resource management. They migrate in search of a healthier environment when untreated sewage and general degradation has caused disease to spread and climate change has worsened the problem. They migrate when their rivers and other water supplies have become too polluted with toxic waste runoff from exploitative companies upstream from them, or when a pandemic has decimated their communities. And on Earth Day, we are particularly concerned with all of these. The COVID-19 pandemic has greatly exacerbated some of the thornier problems of migration, criminalizing such movement, requiring tests, often expensive and even unavailable, quarantining both before and after arrival at a given destination, denying the migrant access to basic facilities like clinics and hospitals, especially if the migrants are undocumented, increasing xenophobia while fixing blame for the spread of the virus on various targeted groups. A good example of this is the escalating number of attacks on Asians in the United States, where they are being blamed as carriers of the disease that reputedly originated in China. Criminalization of migration is all too common. Fear of spreading the infection dictating that migrants be arrested and detained without hearings and for an unlimited amount of time in jail-like facilities instead of being released into the country of destination and in many cases being reunited with their families pending a hearing. Forced repatriations and deportations are being carried out at an increasing rate, and home countries, often unwilling to let the returning migrants in, increase the difficulties of reintegration while pleading lack of resources, ramping up fear of infection, and blaming specific groups of migrants for the spread of disease. Each of the migration issues addressed here has been extensively written and commented on, but this advocacy resource is not intended to present a comprehensive bibliography on the subject. Instead, it presents relevant facts and definitions, good practices, what needs to be done in general, and resources. Depending on the interests of professors, teachers, mentors, and group leaders using this resource, any of these topics could be a very rewarding research project, a source for evidence-based approaches and durable solutions to individual migration issues, and a source of inquiry, comment, and suggestions for advocacy and action, especially in the context of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much for letting me present this paper. Good morning, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone. First of all, thank you to Eva for taking her time to address our audience today. To ground the conversation, with keeping in mind when we talk about climate change and women's rights, to be inclusive and to think of all people affected by climate change, and to think about all women, women that are refugees, women that are migrants, women that are internally displaced persons, girls that are lacking access to health services, to education. I'm more than privileged in these situations to be sitting at a Zoom meeting in a far country like Qatar at this time and talk about these topics to inspire actions. And I'm always interested in looking for the solutions that, for example, organizations like ours, Rotary International, can start delivering as solutions, actions locally, because we need to partner and develop collaborations stronger with everyone that is tirelessly working to build better from this pandemic. That's why this resource that has been created needs to be utilized in a better way. And we can learn a little bit more about it by introducing the next speakers. But before we talk more about the resource, I would like to invite our past president, Sue Peghiny, who is active Rotarian, not only as past president, but also as on a district level. She's assistant governor coordinator and district visionary coordinator. She is very active with Citizens Climate Lobby, and she's the co-chair of our District 7, 9, 10 Environmental Committee and member of the Rotary Action Group on Environment. It's a privilege to have Sue here because Citizens Climate Lobby is started by many years Rotarian who maybe she can be able to share a little bit more about him as well in her speech. But with no further ado, I would like to give the floor to Sue and welcome her to address our audience. Thank you, Sue, for joining us.
Thanks, Tatiana. Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here, and I want to say I'm really honored to be presenting with this amazing group of accomplished women. By the way, I'm having some serious imposter syndrome right now. So I'm going to talk briefly about why it's important for Rotary to take action and to lead on climate change, and a few ways that I've found to do it. First of all, I believe that our reputation as Rotarians is probably our greatest asset. Whether we're the RI president or the newest member of a club, we can all leverage that reputation to fight climate change. That reputation, I think, also kind of makes it critically important and almost an obligation that we do lead on the issue because we want to keep and we want to grow that reputation. Another unique asset that we have is the network of Rotarians around the globe. Just look at this group today, right? We're from everywhere. We have a built-in introduction to almost any city in the world. We can reach out and within a few days, find a potential partner for almost anything, from renting a vacation home in New Zealand, which I did, to finding a global grant partner for a city cleanup project in India, which my club has done. By the way, this is why fellowship exchanges and fellowship groups are so important. It's one thing to make a cold call or email a Rotary Club on the other side of the world. It's quite another to have a personal relationship with a member of that club. This is an important tool that we can use to fight climate change. So I'm a Rotarian heart and soul. Even my husband is. But when my journey to find something to do to help stop climate change started, I was really unhappy that Rotary was not leading on this issue. So I went looking for another way. It turns out in 2007, another Rotarian named Marshall Saunders understood that all the work he was doing for Rotary was threatened by climate change. There's actually a page on the Rotary.org website dedicated to Marshall. He unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. But anyway, he took the lead and he founded an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby. Because he was a Rotarian, this organization feels a lot like Rotary, including a set of core values and being enthusiastically nonpartisan. I mean, enthusiastically. There are a ton of Rotarians in CCL who are leading the way to pass national carbon fee and dividend legislation that will help stop climate change in a significant way and help people who have been unfairly affected by pollution and climate change. It's really a Rotary twofer. Save the planet, save people. It's really a great organization. And the way that I lead in this area is by using that Rotary network to get CCL speakers featured at club meetings. I'm not going to go into the details of CCL here because, like Rotary, it's a big, got a lot of moving parts, you know. But I'll put the link in the chat in case you'd like to learn more, or of course, feel free to reach out to me. Now, I want to acknowledge that some Rotarians are uncomfortable about taking political action, but please remember that while Rotary clubs are not allowed to endorse political individuals or bills or anything, members and clubs are encouraged by RI to, quote, engage with and be informed about any public question involving the general welfare of the community, the nation, and the world, end quote. I think this issue qualifies. Plus, as an individual, all of us have the right to engage in our political process. CCL makes it effective and makes it an effective and rewarding experience. It's really not scary. I was a little scared. It's not scary. Of course, I'm sure like you, I was delighted when Rotary announced that the environment, which I always say is code for climate change, would be the new area of focus. I hope you're all familiar with the Environmental Sustainability Rotary Action Group, or SRAG, which is an international group of Rotarians who led the effort to make this happen. They worked for years on this and were ultimately able to lead the leadership of RI to where it needed to go. Sometimes even the leaders need to be led. I personally think this is the best thing that has happened to Rotary since they accepted women as members. And like accepting women as members, this area of focus will grow and evolve Rotary. I'll also put the SRAG link in the chat. If you're not familiar with SRAG and you care about climate change, I really encourage you to get familiar with SRAG. It's a great organization that's working hard to help clubs and districts bring this new area of focus to life. And the reason I think adding this new area of focus is so good is because of the District 7910 Environmental Committee. A few months after RI announced the new area of focus, I joined with another member in my district to create this committee with the goal of helping clubs get going with environmental projects. We had something like 45 people at our first meeting and probably 10 or 15 more who were interested but couldn't come that night. This told me that there's a lot of interest in this area. A few months later, we've settled down to about 25 people per meeting, which is still pretty good. And a few of them are not even Rotarians. And a few others are from another district because their district doesn't have a similar outlet for this passion. And let me tell you, these people care. They're passionate. They want to spread the word to their communities and their clubs. They want to lead on this issue and make things happen. And they'll do it at the club level, which, as we all know, tends to bubble up to the district, the zone, and finally RI. Rotary is a bottom-up organization. So I think that any Rotarian who takes the lead on almost any climate action can have a huge impact just because they're a Rotarian. As the saying goes, our reputation precedes us. And we have so many resources available to us through our clubs and districts, our Rotary networks like this one, and Rotary International. Let's leverage that reputation, our networks, and those resources to take leading roles in the effort to stop climate change. And we know we can solve big, hard problems, right? Polio proved that. Plus all the gazillion district grants that have been done around the world. So many people want to move on this problem. So let's lead the way. We can do it. We've done it before. Let's do it again. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sue, for sharing your insights and experience in the past period in leading the way in our district. It is incredible when you find people that think the same and want to act and join forces. But in the same time, it's very inspirational when you see results in communities where you might have not shared the same thoughts and you are able to build a common ground and develop actions together. So climate change, it's an area that can be bringing people together. It's not a divisive topic. It's just important how you approach it and how you discuss the opportunities for finding solutions together. Part of the actions that Physicians for Social Responsibility are working for many years on raising awareness on connection of the climate change and the public health. Now it's even easier to be pointed out of the connectivity because public health in one place is global health. And I would like to continue the conversation by pointing out that if we do not get climate change right, it doesn't matter how great things we do in Rotary in the rest of the 6 areas of focus. But if we connect everything, we can understand and see how caring about the people and the planet is in the center of all of these 6 areas and working in the 7th one in the environment. Continuing further, I would like today to welcome a fellow member that we work together on the area related to social protection for this Women Human Rights Resource some months ago. Eva Higabi is an NGO committee member. She's on the Advocacy Research group as a co-chair, and she was the leading coordinator of our group. We work together as part of the focus group addressing health as human right and universal health care. Same later on will join us, Amy, part of this incredible group that just initiated work that many of you might be interested to join and contribute in the future together as well to develop further this resource. But not to go further and to invite Erica, who is a representative to the United Nations in New York for the Federation of the American Women's Clubs Overseas. I would like to share her slides in the presentation and welcome Erica.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing the slides too, Tatiana. Thanks. Great. Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon for some. I am going to walk you through a brief introduction of the Women's Human Rights Teaching, Learning, and Advocacy Resource. You can see the link there for the URL if you want to have a look at it while I'm talking through the different aspects here. So the Feminist Women's Movement Action Plan was started by a group of women at the United Nations with a vision of breaking silos and bringing diverse groups of people together around women's human rights. Part of that vision was the creation of a universities and teaching group to figure out ideas for new learning tools that international feminists and women's movements might use. Tools that would bridge the gap between academia, global activists, and advocates at the United Nations. Next slide, please. 6 peer leaders from this group assembled volunteer teams to develop a teaching resource. These teams, made up of 50 academics, researchers, civil society leaders, and UN experts, spent 6 months developing 42 curricula that roughly follow a lesson plan framework, which include an introduction, learning outcomes, foundational knowledge links, key terms and UN documents, instructional options, resources, and possibly most importantly, advocacy plans. Next slide, please. The topics allowed for the somewhat daunting 6 thematic areas to be broken down into bite-sized pieces. They each include foundational UN agreements and significant human rights documents, but they are also filled with videos, animations, and interactive resources to engage and motivate the audience. The instructional options, group activities, and advocacy plans really highlight the level of academic experience that this group brought to the project. Their skill and ability to engage learners is evident. Next slide, please. The Women's Human Rights Teaching, Learning, and Advocacy Resource you will see online today is a starting point. It is the great hope of the creators of this compendium of knowledge that it will be an evolving resource, that teachers and activists will provide feedback on the materials and create subtopics and modules of their own, and that these new contributions will be incorporated in the online version for others to learn from and in turn build on. Women's human rights exemplifies cross-cutting principles affecting all aspects of life and innumerable issues. The themes and subtopics in the resource are comprehensive, but by no means exhaustive. Next slide, please. Thanks. So in summary, why a women's human rights teaching, learning, and advocacy resource? Because we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to understand the existing international women's human rights mechanisms and ground claims to women's human rights in legally binding obligations and political commitments so that they can be an effective bottom-up movement to change women's lives for the better. What? This resource is a working document that makes the Human Rights Declaration, Beijing Platform for Action, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Sustainable Development Goals, the cornerstones of women's human rights, applicable and accessible to educators and advocates. Who? This is a valuable resource for participation in United Nations advocacy, but also for the private sector, media, universities, grassroots movements, and researchers. How? By breaking silos. This resource creates online access to a working document about women's human rights that is grounded in globally recognized precedents. It's easy to use and accessible to public health experts, environmentalists, business administrators, journalists, mayors, city councils, and cultural innovators. Next slide, please. This is the main page of the research, which you will find at whrtlar.wordpress.com or by Googling Women's Human Rights Teaching, Learning, and Advocacy Resource. It's the only one out there with that name, so it's useful. Next slide, please. By clicking on the modules on that main page, you can see the 6 thematic areas in the resource, including 2 areas that we are touching on today, which is social protection and environmental conservation. 6 modules are inclusive development, shared prosperity and decent work, poverty eradication, social protection and social services, freedom from violence, stigma and stereotypes, participation, accountability and gender responsive institutions, peaceful and inclusive societies, and last but not least, environmental conservation, protection and rehabilitation. Next slide. So by clicking on the modules themselves, once you get into the website, you will see the subtopics within the modules, which you can click on to and see the curricula for each. Here are the current subtopics within the environmental conservation, protection and rehabilitation module, and the poverty eradication, social protection and social services. Which brings me to the end of my presentation, and thanks very much. I hope you all will check it out and use it and contribute to it in your areas of expertise. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Erica. It is important to mention that what it has been started, it's something that will continue with a contribution of the broader collaboration that we are working on, and that's the reason why we are here together to present it to Rotary International and tackle topics that are related to environment and women's rights, as migration, as protection of universal healthcare, access to services, social protection, and many more areas that some of you might be interested as participants to this conversation today. We will continue the discussion with our last but not least glorious speaker today. It's our colleague, Amy Gian. She is a professor at Suffolk University. She is a director of the, just one second. She's the director of the Center for Women's Health and Women's Rights. She teaches sociology and criminal justice as the department chair. Has engaged in public sociology as a co-director of the practicum in advocacy at the United Nations. And with her work, we were able to contribute better to shape up the universal healthcare and health as a human right part of this resource. She recently becomes the executive director of Our Bodies, Ourselves Today, that it's another material that will be in future supporting furthermore women globally, as it has done for many decades before. And we hope that we can collaborate with Rotary International on making it more accessible and contribute to its use further. So please, Amy, join us and continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Sorry, my screen disappeared for a second. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you to my co-presenters here. And it's really an honor to be presenting with such an amazing group of people. I am going to focus on this Earth Day on the health and human rights of refugee and asylum-seeking women. I'm going to talk about this in the context of climate change and from a health and human rights perspective. So you may be asking, can she do it? Can she talk about all those things at once in 10 minutes or less? And you be the judge of that, of whether I have succeeded. So, but I'm going to try. And as the director of the Center for Women's Health and Human Rights at Suffolk, I like to work and think in the connections of all these different issues because we know that they're connected. We've known for forever, we've known for a long time that human rights are connected to the environment, and that without environmental stability, for lack of a better word, you know, the other human rights are profoundly affected. So in recent years, there's been increasing attention to this nexus of climate change, migration, and health. It is, you know, it's a huge area that we, you know, we're never going to exhaust. But I'm going to just give you a little bit on that to kind of see if you want to think with me about those issues. In terms of how those three are related, climate crisis creates and exacerbates refugee and asylum seeking, as well as IDP crises. It can be the source of those, but it generally exacerbates those, you know, push factors that create movements in populations. Becoming displaced, and you know, this might seem obvious, but whether you're an asylee, a refugee, or an IDP, has serious health impacts. And those impacts are physical, they're psychosocial, and reproductive health also are all put at heightened risk for people who are on the move. The climate crisis also clearly has, you know, serious, even existential health impacts. And, you know, I think everybody on this call is aware of how we're seeing some of those now, whether we're talking about direct exposures like heat waves and extreme weather conditions, or through complex pathways, such as altered food yields, water insecurity, changes in disease transmission and vector ecology, which we're seeing right now with the pandemic. You know, with climate change, physical, psychosocial, again, and reproductive health are all at heightened risk. So the causality goes in all the different directions. And, you know, poor health makes a person more vulnerable to the hazards of climate change, as well as less resilient if they're displaced. So, you know, all these things are kind of a, you know, vicious cycle and a toxic stew. So all three of these factors at the nexus of climate change, migration, and health affect women disproportionately. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this very brief presentation. So, and I have to shout out to Rebecca Garcia Bravo, who was a volunteer at the Center for Women's Health and Human Rights, and who did a lot of the research that this part of my talk is based on. So there are physical health issues that are very frequently found in women asylum seekers and refugees. Many of these are the same that men have, but of course, women's health is different as well. And so, you know, the reproductive health issues, you know, including miscarriage, including low birth weight babies, preterm labor, unsafe abortions, and the sequelae of gender-based violence all impact women, you know, disproportionately or exclusively, as the case may be. There are equally psychosocial issues that are found in women asylum seekers and refugees that are, you know, gender-based and, you know, important in terms of the burdens that women are carrying. In addition to specific health issues, refugee and asylum seeking women face particular obstacles. There are some issues that women already are carrying with them from their country of origin. Basically health, you know, deficits in health and sexual education knowledge. You know, these can be things such as sexually transmitted infections, if they have been victims of sexual assault in the process of migration, which is, as you probably know, is extremely common. There is a lack of continuity in contraception when women are migrating for whatever reason. There are issues from their home country that they're bringing with them in terms of gender roles and decision making within the family. To the extent that they're with their families, those don't go away. And there's very often a lack of a healthcare system in the countries that they're leaving, because as we know, the people who migrate are the most vulnerable often. People who are seeking asylum, obviously, not all migrants. I mean, some migrants are relatively privileged and they're going because they can. And others are leaving because they must, because they're the most disadvantaged. There's also a host of issues that women face during and after seeking asylum and gaining refugee status in a host country. And, essentially gender sensitive approaches are needed throughout the asylum seeking. I'm just checking my time here. Okay, I'm good. Gender sensitive approaches are needed throughout the asylum seeking process. So, these are things like reception centers are usually not gender sensitive. There are obstacles to recognizing refugee status that are based on gender. So, identifying the vulnerabilities of women asylum seekers specifically. There are gender barriers, meaning interpreters, doctors, lawyers in the host country are often not women. And for a lot of asylum seeking women, that is a barrier to open communication, as well as language barriers, obviously. This is also, access to the healthcare system in the host country is also where I can tie in universal healthcare, which, as Tatiana was saying, is the area that we worked on together. When you leave a country that didn't have universal healthcare or good access to healthcare, you're in a weaker position. When you enter a country that doesn't have universal healthcare, you're less able to get back on your feet. Even in countries, though, that do have good healthcare with high access, if it's complicated, and if it's costly, and if people have to figure out insurance and, navigating what are the services, this is mostly women who do this everywhere in the world. Women are in charge generally of the health and healthcare for their families. So, this is something that falls on women, as do the complex social realities and cultural religious issues, such as, during physical examinations, women might be very uncomfortable with a male provider, but even with a woman provider, might not be comfortable. There are just a lot of cultural potential barriers that need sensitivity. And of course, all these realities are even more complex for more vulnerable profiles. So, people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, people who are from, hated minorities, people who are from the gay, lesbian, transgender communities. There are all kinds of things, women with disabilities, people who are marginalized have even more difficulties, with these issues. So, stopwatch keeps stopping. Okay. So I've talked a little bit about the health and human rights of refugee and asylum seeking women in the context of climate change from a health and human rights perspective. I hope you feel that I did it and did it in a way that was useful to each of you. And I want to end by just saying that to respect women's health is to respect their human rights. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Amy, for pointing out the importance of how much more sensitive we need to be when we are looking into finding solutions and addressing the needs of women that are in migrant centers, women that are refugees. And speaking about climate change and the reasons why they have left their countries, or what kind of disasters have moved them away from the safety where they used to live. I would like to open the discussion for all the participants, because we are coming closer to the end of today's conversation, and open the opportunity for our speakers to answer questions and hear maybe from some of the participants their perspectives, their views, or how they might have understood and seen the importance of today's conversation, that it's tying the climate change with women's health and rights, but also speaking about migrants and refugees as one of the most vulnerable women and girls. Thank you.
So there is a question in the chat. Brenda asked, is there thought to addressing the issues that cause people to migrate, prevention versus intervention? I'm guessing that question might have been for Amy. But Brenda, if you're here, if you want to clarify, please feel free to speak up.
Oh, it was a general question for any one of the panelists. It's just an area that I think it's huge, and I totally understand that. But if there's in some small way to start looking at why these women in particular have to leave their country of origin, is there a way of creating an environment for them where they'd be able to stay instead of this horrific need and process of trying to migrate and become refugees?
Thank you for your question, Brenda, and I'll invite Amy to continue, but at the start would like to say that if we are looking into sustainable development and really think holistically about solutions and how we are treating everyone in different places, in different countries, equally for their opportunities, for prosperity, for themselves and their families, we would think about their work, their education opportunities, their stability, because security, when we are looking from an angle of are you in a war-torn country or post-conflict country, that's one type of security or insecurity. But you might live in a country that is threatened, that in the next years, due to climate change, as in the small island countries citizens are, that you might not be able to provide for your livelihood to support your family. And that's why you might think of solutions in moving to some other place. So there are different reasons that are triggering the move of persons that are part of the migration that is happening due to economic reasons or due to various other reasons. But if Amy would like to add, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, I'm going to bring this back to human rights and the way that all of these issues, all the push issues that some of which Tatiana was just mentioning, drive people from their homes. By the time that happens, there have been not only multiple systems failures, but complete collapse of all of the systems that should be supporting people and enabling them to stay home. So, the shorthand answer for me is always, human rights, that people, to the extent that societies can support, respect, protect, fulfill human rights, people won't need to leave, right? And so whether that's, food, whether that is safety from armed conflict, or whether it's a stable climate. You know, if you really look at what is forcing people to leave, because most people, except for, you know, there are exceptions, but most people would rather not have to leave their home by a long shot. So, you know, it's usually very extreme. Things have gotten to such an extreme that they need to leave. And so human rights societies, you know, that are respecting and protecting human rights don't have those issues generally. And I'm including climate change in there because we do have a human right to a safe environment. And so, I mean, I believe we really need to treat it as a human right, you know, as a very, very, very critical human right, as they all are. But yeah, that's my short answer, even though, as Eva would say, you know, it's the details are, of course, different everywhere.
Thank you, Amy. If we are thinking more about more sustainable economy that works for the people and the planet, we will be able to promote harmony with the nature. In that way, we can think and act how to restore our world. We can make sure that the human rights of every individual are respected. So more sustainable economies and equality is bringing the opportunities for addressing at the core the reasons why people move and what else is triggering their actions for finding safer places to live. I would like to believe that with Rotary International, having worked over 100 years and being one of the organizations that had supported the establishment of United Nations, we will have more leaders like Sue Peghiny and others that will engage in the discussion on climate change, will engage in breaking the barriers when we talk about building common ground and build collaborations, because everything is happening on a local level. And sometimes we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to create more things. We just need to replicate and utilize what is already existing and reach out for hands for collaboration, because partnerships are in the foundation of better future. When we are not working in isolation, when the multilateralism between countries exists, we are able to work better for the future. And that's why I'm more than happy to see the climate summit happening these 2 days, where United States is stepping in and leading in conversation together with other countries. I look forward to more actions and conversations. But that's why I would encourage everyone who is here today to reach out for partnering and opportunities to follow up with the Rotary Action Groups, with the Rotary Fellowship. If you're not familiar, maybe reach out to some of the Rotary clubs where you live. But in the same time, think about United Nations and how much knowledge is present in your own communities about this incredible organization and the many other entities under it, as well, World Health Organization, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNICEF, and so on. Think about how you can break the stigma about what these organizations are about, what they do, and how much, for example, building partnerships like we do with the United Nations Association of Greater Boston Area, you bring a better environment for your students if you work in academia, or for your members in the civil society sector, to understand how much more they do in sustainable development and toward the climate change actions, and how much they might already are acting towards sustainable development goals achievement, but they might not be aware. That's my final point. And if anyone has more questions, we can continue. If not, I would like to thank everyone. Any questions? Anything else? Anyone else from the speakers would like to add additional comment, call for action?
I put my email in the chat. If anyone's interested in learning more about Citizens Climate Lobby or SREG, I'm happy to talk to you.
I'll just say thanks again for inviting me to speak at this wonderful panel.
Thank you again, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you in the future in other discussions and collaborations. Thank you.
Thanks, Tatiana.